I think the best way to start this is to just kind of define what we're talking about. This is an open question for any of you guys, but what is the new Hollywood? And what does that mean to you? Go for it.
It's a big question to start out with.
I'll revise. What is the new Hollywood, and is there is this boom of Asian filmmaking and attention on Asian artists in front of and behind the camera, is it a fad? Is this something that is going to stay?
So I think the new Hollywood, right, in some ways is no different than the old Hollywood. Yep. We are seeing two pretty fundamental shifts, though, in the business, both behind and in front of the camera, right? Yeah. One is the business itself is losing this historic tight grip on the gatekeeping function that in many ways is representative of the old Hollywood and a structure that kept people like us from doing what we do and kept artists from doing the work they do. Yeah. And that's changing. I don't think it's done, but it won't go backwards, right? And that's because of the second shift, which is globally interconnected audiences, global platforms at scale, like Netflix, like Amazon, like YouTube, like Facebook. The global audience is 60+% Asian. American youth are already minority majority. The instance of interracial dating, marriage, adoption, gay marriage and adoption, if you plot that on a curve, it's nonlinear and it doesn't go backwards, right? So those are permanent fundamental shifts around demographics and the audience, and this creative community suddenly has this like outpouring of content that's always been there but has never had the sort of mode of distribution to get there. And now we're seeing the audience at a critical mass that I think is actually a fundamental shift in the way Hollywood looks at the filmed entertainment business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have two sides to your sort of Asian questions, right? You have the amazing films and television shows coming out of Asia, Parasite being the most recent example, which more than I think likely going to get a Best Picture nomination for an Academy Award. You have series like The Longest Day in Chang'an coming out of China, which I thought was one of the best series to come out of China on a global platform like Amazon Prime for a global audience. And then you have the content that's being created here, the Asian American content with the Hollywood studio system for a global audience. You've seen that with Crazy Rich Asians, Always Be My Maybe, even Killing Eve with the BBC in terms of a perspective. I think, to Sanjay's point, when you have 7 billion people on this planet, 4.4 of which are Asian descent, and if you're creating content for a global audience, that's not going backwards, right? Mm-hmm. There's no way. So creating stories that reflect the world that we live in is, I'm not quite sure if that's the new Hollywood, but that's where we're at and where we're headed.
Yeah, and I think to Hieu's point, I moved to LA from Beijing. And I graduated from Chapman University, couldn't find a job in LA because Hollywood wasn't ready to hire me, even though I spoke English, So I had to move all the way to Beijing. Thankfully, I can speak Chinese. And I started my career developing Chinese content. And the very same scale also attracted, the previous company I worked at, Ivanhoe Pictures, they made me an offer. I moved to Hollywood to create Chinese language content, and then Crazy Rich Asians happened. In the end, I ended up making a Hollywood film, and now I moved to Imagine doing international content. So I think to Sanjay and to Hieu's point, I feel like two waves. I came from one end, and then I moved into Hollywood, and now, I think the idea of Asian and American Asian content, is a very complex and very broad spectrum. And it's only until this past 1 year I see foreign films being celebrated here in LA. And at the same time, Crazy Rich Asians always been my maybe. So certainly we hope, it's staying. Otherwise, I don't know, we're gonna find a new job. I don't know.
We all will.
And open a bar.
Right.
Open a bar, yes.
So I guess if we're in agreement that we're in this new age where different types of stories can be told, are there any stories, Asian stories, that you guys feel like you can tell now, but maybe 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, maybe you couldn't? Or is there a difference in the kinds of stories that you can tell in this marketplace?
Right. Well, I'll start. I think, Crazy Rich Asians is special, right? It's a very popular genre. It's rom-com. It's very easy for everyone to understand. And before Crazy Rich Asians, I had submissions about, immigrant stories, because I feel like, at least as a foreigner, my understanding has always been this is what America understand, when you talk about Asians, as if, our identity is all about as being immigrants, right? And then eventually when Crazy Rich Asians came about, you finally see Asians falling in love on screen. And that felt like a revelation to people, which I don't know why, because from where I grew up in Asia, people fall in love on screen. So to me, that's...
And in real life.
Yeah, and in real life. So to me, that's like, I think sometimes, we like to pigeonhole different people, right? Because of Joy Luck Club, So that was like the first all-Asian cast, and people started talking about, Asian immigrant stories. And then now Crazy Rich Asians, okay, Asians can fall in love. And I hope that, there'll be more, diverse stories, right? Which is why I really like Always Be My Maybe, because she's a chef, he's a musician, they are not ashamed to eat dim sum at a restaurant, but they also play at a club, and they also fall in love. And she can go out with a white guy and it's okay, So I think, it's so weird that we have to define what kind of stories we can tell, because on the very basic level, we're all human beings,
right.
So I think we share the same journey, and like hopefully, I think this year when during the pilot season, all the scripts that I've read are either crazy or rich or crazy and rich. Like I really want to read different stories, and I really encourage, story writers to really tell stories that matter to them, and submit to executives.
Yeah, I think to riff off that a little bit, Crazy Rich Asians is obviously a watershed moment for the community and for the industry in a lot of ways. But for me, I actually get more excited about a Henry Golding being the lead in Last Christmas.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, he's just a guy.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
The romantic lead guy.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's just normal, right? No one really bats an eye at that.
Yeah.
Right? So to me, that is showing we don't necessarily need to tell quote unquote Asian stories.
Yeah.
We can be Asians in stories.
Yeah.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
In stories that exactly. Stories that we weren't represented in before.
Yeah, I think the normalization of an Asian filmmaker making a movie that's not about Asians, or an actor even, I think that's really important in the progression. Are there?
I want to say
Please,
this. The justification these past few years, this past decade, it's all been with the recent success. It really tells everyone it's all been bullshit, right? Because the justification before is we can't tell these stories, or we can't have these actors because nobody's going to watch it. It's not going to make any money, right? So the audience for Crazy Rich Asians or even Black Panther, they didn't just materialize out of thin air. They've always been in existence.
Yeah.
So now if you know this, then you're like, oh, why didn't we tell more of these stories, right? It wasn't because we didn't want to make money. Is because if you really wanted to unpack it, there was either unconscious bias, systemic, all the kind of stuff that we sort of intellectualize, right? So the question is, all right, so now just tell good stories, right? There shouldn't be this limit anymore. The justification was wrong to begin with.
Right. I think something interesting is we've seen in the past in Hollywood, there have been so many stories told about other cultures that were told from a white perspective, from an American perspective, a Western perspective. And I think sometimes it's gotten it wrong. Are there any? Do you guys ever think about movies that represented Asian people in a way, but from a Western or white perspective that got it totally wrong, or were there filmmakers who got it totally right?
That's a whole other panel, man.
Last Samurai.
Short circuit.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot.
There's many, I would imagine. Yeah.
Any anime movie that's been redone here?
Yes, exactly.
There's obviously challenges. I mean, but this goes back to I think, theme of this panel, right?
Exactly.
How important it is to have diversity in the writer's room, in the executive suites, where, you know, and listen, there's still a lot of progress to be made.
Yeah.
I think that is something that, you know, I'm sure there are tons of people here right now who work behind the scenes in the industry, right? And you look at the room that you're in a lot of times, and you know, we're not that represented.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's some nodding here, right? Yeah. But it is. I feel it changed a little bit.
Yeah.
Right? I definitely do. I actually went to Asia after university to work in entertainment for. I was there 6-7 years. This is why Crazy Rich Asians actually is a very personal thing for me. I actually was in Singapore acting with a lot of those folks for MediaCorp at that time. And I remember thinking really early on that no matter how good you are there, right, and you know, listen, very small market versus the US, but no matter how good you are as an actor, as a performer, as an artist, you know, you are so dependent on all the other people behind the scenes, right? The cast and directors who are actually going to cast you, the writers who are going to write the stories, like on set with the people who are actually directing, lighting, micing you up and everything, right? The executives who are actually green lighting the shows. And, you know, I think you realize how little power sometimes you have as a performer, right? So again, so important to have that representation now.
On the flip side of that, were there times in your careers where you kind of realized, oh my God, that there's an opportunity for Asians in the film industry, or things are getting better? There are signs of change. What were those?
Well, I think I have a very specific moment when you ask that question.
Sure.
For me, 17 years ago. This is 2002, January, Sundance Film Festival. I'm standing outside the Eccles Theater with Justin Lin right before the premiere of Better Luck Tomorrow. Wow. And I thought to myself, man, I can't believe I'm going to be witnessing this. This is history in the making, right? Everything's going to change from this point on. And little did I know, jack shit changed. And I learned a super valuable lesson, you know, at that time. It's like, if you really want sustainable change, you've got to push forward. You've got to sort of push for action and not wait on others, right? Like, these moments come and go, but when there's a sort of momentum, you've got to sort of push ahead, right? And sort of capture that momentum, because I don't know, I'd like to have another 20 years go. It would be insane.
I think for me, I felt very desperate when I graduated from university, because it was really a time when Hollywood was starting to take notice of Asia, and Wanda was buying legendary AMC. Sure. And I went to different places, I pitched myself, I was trying to get a job. They like the fact that I'm Singaporean, they feel like I'm borderline Western, but I'm also Asian enough, but no one had the guts to hire me. So it was almost out of desperation. I felt like, okay, screw this, I'm gonna go back to motherland China, and I did that. And I feel like, for me, when I was in China, what was interesting to me was Hollywood was so interested in Asia, and as you know, you've been heading the business for a long time, and everyone was talking about co-production. Yeah. So that was like a moment when I started thinking like, is there a chance where two territories can actually come together, and many have tried, many have failed. And of course, culturally, stories, they don't always transcend and really resonate with both territories. But, since moving back to LA, since having experienced Crazy Rich Asians, since watching The Farewell, I'm feeling very optimistic again. Even at Imagine, the kind of projects that I'm reading or developing, whether it's a local language for China, or is it a global, international format, we always want to make sure that the content that we do has a wide reach. We really want to bring the world together. And to Sanjay's point, with streamers, with global platforms, you don't just really make content for one territory anymore, right? So the business is pushing for it, and I feel like right now we have executives, we have filmmakers who are primed for a movement like that.
One thing I noticed when I came back, so I was in Asia for 6-7 years during the 2000s, all the way back then. When I came back, one thing I noticed was on TV, way more Asian faces on ads. And it was a bit shocking not being in the States for, I would come back for Christmas, but that's it, right? So coming back and seeing that, I was like, okay, so the advertising space is starting to recognize that there's an Asian buying power in the US, right? So started thinking to myself, when is Hollywood sort of start to catch up, right? Because I do think sometimes advertisers are a little bit forward thinking when they're looking at this stuff. And to your point before about the numbers, right? It being more of a numbers game and seeing, from a studio perspective, not speaking for Disney, making sure that is out there, but
very clear.
We are going to, we as studios are obviously looking at that constantly, right? And seeing which demographics over convert, who's buying what. And it also just makes financial sense now, right?
Yeah.
So that's a big change as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think, you guys have all mentioned kind of moments that stuck out to you, these kind of milestones in the evolution of what we can describe as the new Hollywood. It's, Better Luck Tomorrow was kind of a false start. Crazy Rich Asians certainly feels like a start. The Farewell, Always Be My Maybe, all of these kind of moments and projects. Are there any milestones that you guys feel like have yet to come or that you're excited to see? One thing that comes to mind for me is Shang-Chi, is an Asian, all Asian superhero movie.
Yeah.
But
I started watching Kim's Convenience because of that guy.
Yeah.
It's actually really funny. I was
It
like,
is.
wow. I was impressed with what they're doing in Canada.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm talking too much, but I will say really quickly,
please.
something I thought about in anticipation of this panel that I'm excited about is it's actually twofold, right? So you're seeing now these young Asian female directors being pegged, right? So I'm talking about Chloe Zhao, who's doing The Eternals for us, right? It was just announced that Deborah Chow is going to be doing the new Star Wars
Mandalorian.
Disney Plus. She's doing the Obi-Wan series. You have Kathy Yan, who is a fellow alum from my school, which I'm very proud of. She's doing Birds of Prey for Warner Brothers, right? That's huge, right? So they're not doing Asian stories per se, right? But these are young Asian women who are going to have like $200 million or more budgets, right? And that to me is amazing. That is really cool.
Yeah. I think, yes, I feel like that's what you were talking about, inclusion, right?
Yeah.
How Henry Golding is in Last Christmas.
Yeah.
You don't see as a Asian content, At the same time, I also feel like there's space for Asian stories to be told, and for that milestone to happen, I feel like, changes have to be made at every level, like companies, can we hire more Asian executives? Can, foreigners, Asian Americans, because it's like I've pitched stories to people before. When I was explaining China to non-Chinese, it takes a lot of work. But when I have like a person whom I know understand where I'm coming from, I can trust that person being my advocate, right? And I feel like, sometimes stories, they fall through the cracks because we don't have enough executives that will advocate for such stories, that would say that, hey, this would work, and or have the guts to hire, Asians, immigrants as talents.
Yep.
Right, so I feel like more decision makers, more executives. So that way we can create the milestone, Crazy Rich Asians, Always Be My Maybe will not just be like a fad,
Right.
We really want to see those, trends staying for a long time.
And it's an entire ecosystem. It's these executives. I would say it's agencies, such as UTA.
Absolutely.
It's when we talk about, I think it's incredible with we talk about directors, we talk about actors, we talk about a lot of stuff, in front of the camera. But even for anybody who's done a film, obviously, the below the line talent, the department heads, right? Name me right now in this room, right? What's the most high-profile Asian American production designer, costume designer, DP, right?
Yeah.
I would say majority of us here would have a challenge saying one person, one name, right, on a high-profile level. And that is rarely talked about, right? So we have all these milestones to come, like a lot of them, because it takes this sort of ecosystem to have all the different types of storytelling that we would want to do, right? That have these perspectives. It's not just, usually in the sort of public's imagination, it's like Hollywood is some kind of monolith, right? That sort of makes these decisions for the world, but it's a bunch of people, right? From finance executives to marketing executives to casting, to the agents, to the producers. There's this entire ecosystem. If that ecosystem is homogenous, then we get one type of stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I share a little story?
Sure.
So, there's this, project that I knew about, it's a very funny rom-com. It's about Asians. It came from a producer, and she was really looking for female Asian writers to work on it. So I recommended a few to that producer, and none of my writer friends got, any callback. I called one of them. And then they told me that, because, your producer friend said, we need a Nora Ephron of Asian writers. I'm like, we've never been given a chance to be the Nora Ephron, Exactly. So, again, the ecosystem has never allowed us to be the Nora Ephron of Asians, the Christopher Nolan of Asians. And I feel like we need to start grooming, start nurturing, start believing, in, Asians, people of color, just to, make sure that this ecosystem is supportive enough, so that it will not be a fad.
Yeah.
That's well said.
Fair enough.
Well said.
Look, I know I spend a lot of time looking for young executives of Asian descent who, many of whom are bilingual, and it's hard to find people, and it's hard to train people, and it's hard to promote people, but it's so worthwhile in that process. And I do it all the time, and I'm, a white Jewish guy from New York. Do you guys find that do you feel like you have a responsibility to find young people and bring them up who, are like yourselves and have similar backgrounds?
So I absolutely do, both at this company, my last company was set in the urban hip-hop scene. We had 125 people, 100 people of color.
Yeah.
It's not like anything you've ever seen before, and it's all people that, if you said there's a pipeline problem, I would have said, come to our office, I'll show you 100 kids running around, right? So that systemic change cannot happen until people go out of their comfort zone, start looking at resumes in a different way, not filtering necessarily by where someone went to school or what fraternity they were in or who their neighbor's nephew was. So there's no pipeline problem. There is a shit ton of talent out there, right? It's just all out there, right? But to Hieu's point, it's an ecosystem, right? And the senior level executives at studios, at mid-sized studios, in the financing world, at the agencies, don't look like this room, right? And so it gets very frustrating when you're trying to bring up emerging writers, directors, actors, producers, and the response you get is, we love this, but we need a big showrunner on it. It's like, well, there aren't. I mean, there's one. Now there's one more, right? So we need Randall, right? And so that becomes the lightning rod, and then there are one or two of them for a while, and then when one of them has a bomb, which they will, of course,
like anyone,
creative people taking creative swings, right? They don't get the license to play again, right? And then it gets seen as a fad, and we go back to doing what we normally do, which is white guys can make movies, and they bomb all the time, and no one says, let's change this up. So the systemic change, right, is needed beyond just in front of the camera talent, right? That, I think, there is a moment now between the South Asian community, the East Asian community, the Asian American community, Asian cinema, which obviously is a huge tradition, is getting recognized here again, right? That, I think, is is going in a good direction, but the sort of deep infrastructure, right? Financing, we talked about a little bit. I mean, I get told all the time, this project will not travel.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? What do you mean? It stars an Indian guy, like won't play in India? Like, what do you mean? Who decided it won't travel, right? And when in my last company, we made urban content and with content with black people, it's like it won't travel. It's like, really? It's the biggest music in the entire world. It's the most streamed music on all of Spotify. We have projects with guys that will sell out stadiums in Bombay. You're telling me a movie with them won't travel?
Right.
But it's these old models that they run that say that person has never been in a movie, and so I cannot project what that movie will do in Spain or in Colombia, right?
And the amazing thing that's happening now, right, if we talk about this sort of new Hollywood, is for the first time in Hollywood history, outside of Netflix, right, you have Disney Plus, you have HBO Max, you have Peacock, you have studios that have a direct one-to-one relationship with their audience. And so now, which is a weird thing to think about, like the studios, how often, because of the different distribution models, really didn't have an understanding of what the audience was watching in real time, right? And who was watching it. So now this data allows you to sort of cut through some of that unconscious bias. So there's just sort of notion that people, a story featuring an Indian American family won't be watched by people in Alabama versus Poland versus Australia. Then you're looking at the data and you're like, oh, that's actually bullshit. That actually doesn't hold. Like Netflix actually knows this, but they haven't been sharing this for the past few years, because why? When you have a competitive advantage, why would you share that, right? But now the studios are getting into that business, and I think that's where we're going to see some change in terms of, oh, that story will travel now.
It's all, I mean, the internet, I come from the internet, and Hieu spent a lot of time in the internet. Like, this is why those businesses eat everyone's lunch, right? Because they're built on overserving underserved audience segments. So things that Hollywood thinks are niche, people from the internet know are huge, right? Like so-called niche markets, right? Before Netflix's original series ramped up in India, the biggest series on Netflix in India was the German sci-fi series Dark, right? No one would have guessed that, right? Defies all conventional wisdom, right? And we spent a lot of time talking to people here about that market, which is a priority market for Netflix. They say, I don't understand how it can be such a big market for American content. And sometimes you remind people, there are more English speakers in India than there are in America. It's a pretty big English-speaking market, so.
Yeah, or if you look at like shows like Longest Day in Chang'an or The Kingdom, which are foreign language shows and dark, and they're translating on these services. And I think it's because people can explore a little bit more on these streaming services. A massive advantage for Disney and for HBO Max and all these companies who are launching right now.
Even like a show like Terrace House, which is a Japanese reality show, and that's actually one of my favorite shows. Like I would have never watched that if it wasn't on a streamer.
Yeah, and I think Janice's point, about, the Nora Ephron of China or whatever, like, there are so many examples of, well, this group never had the opportunity to become this thing or to try this other thing. And I think, you guys in your positions as executives have that opportunity and can pay it forward. What do you think that, it sounds like having executives and having people in the room who are buyers is a real shift that needs to happen for this new Hollywood to really take effect. Is a connection to this community, is that important? And do you think that helps to create more talent and create more opportunities?
Certainly. I mean, I'm super encouraged by the fact that Hieu and Sanjay, they are business owners, So when you're business owners, you have a say, right? And I feel fortunate in the sense that, Imagine has the appetite for international content, So in a way, when we're placed, at, position that comes with power, then we can empower other people, right? So it's back to, building ecosystem, having advocates, that can, support your stories. And yes, I'm like I said earlier, I'm very optimistic. And also, I was just thinking about, when even now we're pitching new content, with digital platforms, it's giving you a new set of comps, right? In the past, when we were making Crazy Rich Asians, this was before we landed at Warner Brothers, I had to do comps, and I didn't know what comps.
No comps. Yeah.
Yes, I was like, do I use Memoir of a Geisha? What do I use? And do I look at Michelle Yeoh's past films? There's just no comp for it, And I remember when I was in film school, I was always inspired by the fact that how Hollywood, to me at that time when I was very young, 19 years old, it was like the epitome of innovation. Then until I started working, I feel like sometimes people take innovation for granted, right? So I feel now with digital platforms, you have new set of data, the reason of not having comms, shouldn't be an excuse anymore. Mm-hmm. Like the same thing, there's no Nora Ephron or female writers. I don't think that's a valid reason. If we're producers, if we're executives, our responsibility is to push the boundary. Yep. So if we don't push the boundary, we're not going to create space. We're not going to create room for change, to stay and to happen. So I'm really hoping that, we continue to keep supporting each other, and I really want to encourage people here to sometimes it just takes a little bit of imagination to see the future. It's really not very hard. Like I said, we all said, agents can fall in love. It's not very hard, so it's just a little bit of the imagination.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think the big question is kind of, do audiences, now that Hollywood has seen, okay, Crazy Rich Asians can work, all these movies we've been talking about, all these things that can work, do you think there is just this opportunistic, okay, now we need to make movies for the Asian community, or do you think this is something where all audiences really want to see these films, and there just was, there never was the opportunity, and now, everyone's just rushing to see these different stories, these diverse stories. Which path are we on?
I think that there's a real opportunity to tell so many more stories, right? So specifically my company, we were the first production company backed by a major Hollywood studio to have the explicit mandate of telling Asian American stories, right? Not to say that to me, that's actually kind of sad. And we certainly don't want to be the last. But when you look at Asians in America, from the beginning of the 1800s till now, you've got to be thinking, whoa, perhaps there have been more stories, right? Yeah. And the example that I like to use and tell people is, during the American Civil War, right? The Union and the Confederates. This is 1860s. Abraham Lincoln is president of the United States. There were Asian American soldiers on both sides of the Confederacy and the Union fighting in that war, right? And if you look at pop culture, when you think of Gone with the Wind, or even Steven Spielberg's most recent Lincoln, it wouldn't have been weird to see an Asian dude in the background in uniform, right? Yeah. But we just haven't seen that. Right. So why isn't those stories being told, right? If you grow up here, you don't see that in the history books, right? You rarely see it in pop culture. So it's just one example of so many, right? At the intersections of identity, race, social class, sexual orientation, all that, that can be told in a really compelling and entertaining way. So I think there's a huge runway.
Yeah, I think it will be opportunistic. There will be a lot of projects that are like anything that's like that, because that's how the town is. If there's a movie about a battleship, then every other studio wants to do a movie about a battleship, right? Yep. Until one of them sinks. But I think what Hieu's doing with his partners is an amazing example, because what we're seeing, I think, is the more culturally specific your story can be, ironically, the more universally interesting it is, right? And that's something I think Hollywood has historically sort of forgotten, because they are a kind of mass media business, right? So they're thinking of movies that have to open on 4,000 screens, and that creates this instinct to play to the lowest common denominator in a lot of ways, right? We want to have one of these, one of these, one of these, a storyline like this, a little love interest, and you kind of create stuff that seems to appeal to everybody and ends up actually really being meaningful to nobody, right? And so stories that have a real granular specificity, where people can, we all laugh when someone farts. We all cry when someone dies of cancer. Like, we all get scared when something jumps out of the closet. Like, there's actually some very universal themes that a lot of very culturally specific movies hit. And so that, I'm hopeful people are starting to say, oh, right, the lead can just be an Asian American guy. And it doesn't really need to be about him being Asian American.
Yeah, right? I wonder sometimes whether we've underestimated our audience. Because we keep
feels like it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, every time we provide these new things, people show
people
up.
See, because they're different and fresh, right?
Yes.
Always Be My Maybe. That had all the touchstones of a rom-com. It was the most normal rom-com.
It
really was.
Yet told from a very specific perspective.
Exactly.
That's what makes it appealing. Like, as long as the stories have universal human themes, you're gonna want to watch it. And you don't want to watch the same shit. You want to watch new shit. Right?
The Big Sick, Get Out. People are like, are those multicultural movies? I mean, Get Out is a Hitchcock.
Yeah, I think
they're just good movies.
I just feel like because, for the longest time, when you talk about Asian or when you talk about immigrant, right, to executives who are not Asian or immigrant, it's such a blank. Right, so maybe sometimes in their efforts to overcompensate, they've underestimated the audience, and this is why we come up with different rules and guidelines as to what would work out there, and it's just so funny, But the proof is, time and time again, to Sanjay's point, we all laugh at the same thing. We all cry because of the same thing.
Yeah. I think I'm supposed to wrap up, but I just thought of this. There was an interesting stat I saw recently where the Asian American audience, for movie-going audience, was by far the largest growth area over the last 2 years. And I think it's just because they're movies that actually are diverse and inclusive and representative of that audience, and everyone wants to see those movies. So anyway, keep going to the movies, keep watching TV. Thanks, everybody. This has been great. And thank you, panelists.
Thanks.